Good afternoon, and welcome to our program, A Brilliant Pictorial Record, Georgia O'Keeffe and the Alfred Stieglitz Collection at the Art Institute of Chicago, in honor of Georgia O'Keeffe's birthday today, November 15th. I am Shannon Bay, the Program Manager of Adult and Community Engagement at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. I would like to begin by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people, on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. Now for some Zoom housekeeping. If you have not done so, please introduce yourself in the chat. You have the option to send a message to everyone or the host and panelists. We encourage you to share with everyone where you're tuning in from today. And also we're going to utilize the chat for questions for our presenter, Sarah Kelly Oehler, which she will answer at the end. So please include any questions you have for her in the chat. You can close the chat box by clicking on the X if it's distracting to you. We also offer closed captioning, which is the CC on your screen. It's at the top or bottom, depending on your device. So you can turn that on or off by clicking the CC. And I would like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here with us today. Your support made this event possible. And if you're not yet a member and enjoy this program, please consider joining today. Visit gokm.org/membership to learn more. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Sarah Kelly Oehler. Sarah is the Field-McCormick Chair and Curator, Arts of the Americas at the Art Institute of Chicago. Her latest project was the acquisition and installation of the Hartwell Memorial Window, a monumental window by Tiffany Studios. In 2018, Oller curated the critically acclaimed Charles White, a retrospective, the first major retrospective of this influential African-American artist in several decades. Other recent exhibitions include Pathways to Modernism, American Art, 1865 to 1945, Whistler's Mother, an American Icon, returns to Chicago, America After the Fall, painting in the 1930s, Shatter Rupture Break, the Modern series, and They Seek a City, Chicago and the Art of Migration, 1910 to 1950. She has contributed to numerous other exhibitions and publications at the museum, including Whistler paintings and drawings at the Art Institute of Chicago, Ivan Albright paintings at the Art Institute of Chicago, and American Modernism at the Art Institute of Chicago from World War I to 1955. She received her PhD in American Art from Columbia University and her BA in History from Yale University. Please welcome Sarah.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm so pleased to be here and have this kind invitation to speak tonight at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, at least virtually. I'd rather be there in Santa Fe with you all. But I'm so pleased you could join us tonight on O'Keeffe's birthday. That's just really special. And so while I'm doing this, let me start sharing my screen. But I wanted to say before I get going that I'm just beginning now to work on a book project that relates to this lecture tonight on O'Keeffe and the Stieglitz collection at the Art Institute. And so this really gave me an opportunity to dig into my research and present some of my initial findings. So this is very much an evolving story, but it's focused on her intersections with the city of Chicago. And it's a story that really demonstrates O'Keeffe's incredible talent as an artist, but also I think her keen intellect and her thoughtful approach in allocating the Stieglitz collection in a way that really created a legacy for herself as well. So let me get started. All right. So in 1987, 1 year after the death of Georgia O'Keeffe, the Art Institute received a bequest from her estate. And this is something that occurred at an act of generosity that occurred at many museums throughout the country. But the gift for us included 4 oil paintings that spanned exactly 50 years of her career. The first and earliest was this work you see here, Ballet Skirt or Electric Light of 1927. And this is an incredible abstraction that, in fact, she also at various times titled as being From a White Rose, which I think you can see here. And then next we have the brilliant composition. It was Yellow and Pink 3 from 1960. And it, as I think you can guess, evokes flying over the country in airplanes. while black rock with blue sky and white clouds underscores her love of monumental rock forms. And then the final painting in the group was, in fact, literally of a monument. This is From a Day with Juan 4, which depicts a visit to Washington, D.C., in which she saw the Washington Monument. And then lastly, there was one absolutely gorgeous pastel in the group, White Shell with Red, which dates to 1938 and certainly relates to a number of other landscapes at this time with this magnified form of a shell against a red hill. And so as a whole, this group gives incredible evidence of O'Keeffe's creativity and her versatility as an artist across, indeed, this 50-year period. But the bequest cannot be seen in isolation, for in fact, it was the culminating moment of O'Keeffe's long relationship with the Art Institute, one that began when both the artist and the museum were still quite young and continued for over 8 decades. And in other words, O'Keeffe designated this bequest as part of the Art Institute's Alfred Stieglitz collection. And it was a gift of nearly 400 works of art that represent a significant part of the extensive collection formed by Alfred Stieglitz during the many years that he ran his galleries. And I'm showing you just 2 photos here, but his entire collection included some 850 paintings, drawings, watercolors, sculptures, pastels, and many other works by the artist is supported, as well as thousands of photographs, both by himself and by his contemporaries. And in so many ways, the Alfred Stieglitz collection was the physical manifestation of his years of significance as a dealer, gallerist, and collector. But while Stieglitz might have formed the collection, when it came to its dispersal after his death, O'Keeffe herself was the crucial figure, and that's really the story I want to talk about tonight. Stieglitz's will named her the executor and left decisions about his collection in her hands. So it was really O'Keeffe who recognized that only by distributing it to major museums, like the Art Institute, would Stieglitz's impact continue to be felt. She actually wrote in 1949, quote, "It is impossible for me to give the collection to any one institution and expect his ideas to be housed. The collection has grown too large. If the material is not seen, opinion is not being formed. Having in mind that pictures should be hung, I had to divide it, as I always told him." So by making this decision to carefully allocate the Stieglitz collection to museums such as the Art Institute, and then actually by enhancing it for many years with additional works by O'Keeffe herself throughout the course of her life, O'Keeffe ensured that the artists supported by Stieglitz would stay at the very center of any discussion of modern art. Her actions, therefore, not only had great significance for my institution and for other museums, but really for anybody interested in American modernism, students, scholars, artists, and so on, for generations to come. Now, having said all that, it's very apparent to me that O'Keeffe's largesse to the Art Institute was not a foregone conclusion, even though, as we all know, she was born in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, which is a small town not far from Madison, Wisconsin, and therefore not particularly far from Chicago in that, at that moment. But as we also all know, O'Keeffe's family moved to Williamsburg, Virginia in 1902. And so that really reoriented them towards the East Coast. But despite that move of her family, O'Keeffe did in fact live in Chicago twice in her younger years. And this is very much to do with Chicago at the turn of the century. The city was the transportation and business hub for the entire Midwest. It had trains converging on it from all directions, and there were incredible fortunes being made in the city in meatpacking and in retail and many other industries. By 1893, so not long after O'Keeffe's birth, it had been declared the second city, that is second only to New York in population size, and it was certainly a city familiar to O'Keeffe's family even before their move. Now, importantly, O'Keeffe had relatives living in Chicago. Her mother's siblings, Aunt Ollie and Uncle Charlie Totto. And Aunt Ollie was employed as a stenographer, and Uncle Charlie worked as a bookkeeper and apparently as a mustache groomer. And so at least initially, they lived in the heart of downtown Chicago. For many reasons, I think, in 1905, when this 17-year-old O'Keeffe decided to strike out on her own and head off to school, she moved to Chicago and moved in with the Tottos. Now, her purpose in the city was to study at the School of the Art Institute, and this was just blocks from where they were living at the time. And the Art Institute had been founded in 1879, just a few years before O'Keeffe's birth. And although the museum's collections were pretty small at this point, by 1905, the school had already established itself as an important site nationally for academic training. Accounts of her time at the School of the Art Institute suggest that she in fact had a pretty rocky start. At first, her studies, as was typical of all incoming students, focused entirely on sketching from plaster casts. And this was very standard practice for pedagogy in art academies at the time. And so I'm showing you here a photograph of just one of many rooms of plaster casts at the Art Institute at the turn of the century. And then next to it, you're seeing a sketch by O'Keeffe of a bust that's clearly the Apollo Belvedere, and it's clearly therefore something that she sketched at the School of the Art Institute. But she found this pretty boring. She didn't particularly like this task of sketching from casts, and frankly, she actually received sort of relatively low marks at first, which I think was a bit surprising. But she pressed onwards and began studying with this man, John Vanderpoel. And he was a Dutch-born artist who specialized in the human figure. And he ran a life drawing class where there was actual models that they could sketch from. But O'Keeffe recounted that she was deeply startled and embarrassed when she first encountered a nude male model. Certainly an experience so shocking for the young O'Keeffe that she actually remembered it and recounted the story 70 years later in her autobiography as still being sort of very fresh in her mind. But under Vanderpoel, despite the initial shock, she developed her skills at drawing. And by February of 1906, so just a few months after she had enrolled at the museum, at the school, she had begun to receive the top marks in her class. And she later described Vanderpoel as, in fact, quote, one of the few real teachers I have known. However, if you know anything about O'Keeffe, all of this came to a very abrupt end after her first year, when O'Keeffe contracted typhoid during her summer break in Virginia. And when she resumed her studies a year later after recuperating, she didn't return to Chicago, but she traveled north to the Art Students League in New York. Now, O'Keeffe's other youthful experience in Chicago, her other time living in Chicago, came shortly thereafter, when in the fall of 1908, and frankly, with her family facing significant financial hardships, she once again moved back to Chicago to seek employment at this point. She lived again with her relatives, and she freelanced as a commercial illustrator. Now, it has been suggested by family, sort of family lore, that she designed the Old Dutch cleanser motif. But in fact, we have no proof of that. And in fact, we have almost no knowledge whatsoever of the work that she was doing in Chicago. The one thing we do know is that she disliked it intensely. It was a grinding pace. It kept her from painting. And as she said, quote, there seemed to be no time to think of anything else. And so around 1910, she became ill again, this time with measles. One wonders about this history of coming to Chicago and becoming ill. And so she left again, and she certainly did not move back after that point. Now, this might have been the end of O'Keeffe's Chicago story. We could all go home now, except for one man, and that is this man here, Daniel Catton Rich. And I don't think you would ever know his name necessarily, but at the Art Institute, he is celebrated as an extremely talented curator and then a longtime director of the museum. And O'Keeffe and Rich developed a very close friendship over many years. And it's this friendship that reinvigorated her connections to Chicago. It helped shape her career, and it became a key factor in the distribution of the Stieglitz collection at the Art Institute. Now, it might make some of you happy to know, in fact, that their history together started in New Mexico in 1929, which is, of course, that pivotal year when O'Keeffe was reintroduced to the Southwest. Both O'Keeffe and Daniel Catton Rich were guests of Mabel Dodge Lujan at her home in Taos, and became friends through their stay at that time. But I would say that their friendship really took off several years later. In fact, in late 1942, they met again in New York, and I think really from that moment became fast friends. And so the upshot is that O'Keeffe, or rather Rich invited O'Keeffe to exhibit her paintings at the Art Institute just a few months later, which is unfathomable to a curator nowadays, that a show would open several months after the invitation. But it opened on January 21st, 1943. Now, as we all know, she had been exhibiting steadily at Stieglitz's gallery since the 1920s. But those shows tended, not exclusively, but tended to show a singles year work. And so the show at Chicago was her first solo show to ever be held at a museum. And it was certainly, I think, the largest collection of her works to be seen outside of New York City. So this was a very consequential exhibition. Now, the show included 61 works. All of them were lent through Stieglitz's An American Place gallery. And they ranged from very early career works to her most recent canvases. And the retrospective really demonstrated both her broad range of subject matter that we see throughout her entire career, and as well her penchant for working through preferred motifs in multiple compositions. And I think it's fair to say that many of the paintings are instantly recognizable as some of her greatest works. So for example, she represented 1920s abstraction beautifully with such key works as Blue and Green Music and Black Abstraction, both of which you see here. There were incredible works from her Lake George period, or times at Lake George, such as Farmhouse Window and Door and From the Lake, which is such a phenomenal abstraction itself. There were 3 New York skyscraper paintings from the late 1920s, representing that moment of her career. And there were 6 Jack in a Pulpit paintings from 1930, and I'm showing you only 5 of them. And then finally, the most recent Southwestern landscapes and other works were beautifully represented with skull paintings such as these that are at the Met, and major examples that demonstrated her love of the striking desert terrain and the architectural forms. And so the exhibition really established the visual parameters of her career, of what she wanted her career to look like up until that point. Equally importantly, Rich wrote an essay for the Catalogue that has become the defining statement of her early career. And it was certainly written in great conversation with O'Keeffe. But it explored her life and her career. It touched on many familiar milestones. So for example, her early studies, her teaching, how she met Stieglitz, her love of nature. Indeed, as her biographer Roxana Robinson has written, she said, quote, "Rich's essay contained the biographical structure of the O'Keeffe myth as it would be retold again and again." So the essay itself really, I think, did a lot before Rich ultimately concluded that, quote, "The place of O'Keeffe is secure. American painting of our day is infinitely richer for her triumphant vision." Now, we know that O'Keeffe arrived in town to help work with Rich. She arrived a week early to hang the show. And I have searched, but unfortunately we do not seem to have a single photograph in our archives of O'Keeffe's work at the Art Institute, of her in action. But we do know that this participation in installing the show received tremendous notice in the press. It was actually seen as quite unusual. And this is sort of one of my favorite descriptions of it, where Marcia Wynne wrote, quote, "With Miss O'Keeffe, the hanging of a picture is important as its painting. She is a slight, wirely little woman with a face of exquisite, coin-like beauty, done almost in pale sepia, and brown hair wound in a coronet, but she lugged her heavy paintings in their frames of copper and stainless steel like an automaton. Before she was through, of course, she had Daniel Catton Rich, Institute director, discarding his jacket and racing around in a yellow sweater and maroon tie to help, and before she was really through, she was in bed with the flu." And indeed, she did get the flu. So she attended only 3 of the many dinners that were hosted in her honor before retreating to the Blackstone Hotel to recuperate. But despite her illness, newspaper coverage of the exhibition was extensive in Chicago and branched out nationally from there. So reporters eagerly detailed the social events planned for her. They commented on her outfits, on her appearance, and demonstrated, even in 1943, a fascination with her public persona that certainly continues to this day. But in the end, I think the effort was worth it. Reviews were extremely positive of the show. One critic wrote, "The 3 galleries glow with the clear, clean, luminous color of her work." Another noted the, quote, "combination of intense emotion, penetrative imagination, and great delicacy of feeling in her art." And then this is my favorite of all. The third author concluded an essay with, if you like her work, you love it. If you don't, you can't forget it," which seems very appropriate. But these notices really helped reinforce her reputation as one of the preeminent artists of the era. So there were, in fact, many important outcomes to emerge from this exhibition. The show that the hosting of the show codified a desirable narrative of her art and work through Rich's essay. It established a core group of important works, and it helped broaden her reputation beyond the Southwest and beyond New York. It also directly impacted the Art Institute's collection. Daniel Catton Rich purchased Black Cross, New Mexico from the show. And this is the first painting by O'Keeffe to enter the Art Institute's collection. It was widely heralded by the Chicago press at the time, and it's certainly a major example and a gorgeous example of her work from that important 1929 summer in the Southwest. But I would also argue that this 1943 exhibition had a direct bearing on O'Keeffe's subsequent actions in regard to Stieglitz's own collection. So first of all, it cemented the friendship between O'Keeffe and Rich, and that alone, for reasons I'll discuss, was quite significant. But in fact, of the 61 works that were in the exhibition, 24 of them, which is a significant portion, well over 1/3 of the works, would be dispersed to museums as part of the Stieglitz collections as they went out to the country, starting only a few years later. And so we see, for example, 9 of the works in the show going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We see 6 of them going to the Art Institute, joining Black Cross, New Mexico. 2 of them ended up at Philadelphia, and 1 at Fisk University. And as you may know, O'Keeffe chose Fisk, which is a historically Black university, as one of the recipients of the Stieglitz collection, thanks to her friendship with Carl van Vechten. And then finally, remember all the Jack in the Pulpits? They largely ended up at the National Gallery of Art in 1987 as part of the same bequest that affected the Art Institute. So in other words, it seems that O'Keeffe and Rich's collaboration on the 1943 retrospective in Chicago would prove highly influential when the artist, following the death of Stieglitz just 3 years later, began considering which paintings would form his legacy and which would be also her legacy. Now, O'Keeffe found the task of dispersing the Stieglitz collection extremely daunting, and she gratefully turned to Rich and a few other people for counsel. But she wrote to Rich in 1948, for instance, "I'm very appreciative of the help you've given me. It is too many things for me to decide alone." Now, I should say right off the bat, most of their discussions are lost to history because, in fact, what I've figured out is that they met frequently. Even though they're living in different parts of the country, they met frequently and discussed the Stieglitz collection in person. I've sort of ascertained from letters that Rich visited O'Keeffe in New York multiple times between 1946 and 1949. He was often traveling to New York, as a matter of fact. And every time O'Keeffe crisscrossed the country, she was stopping in Chicago to meet with Rich. But that said, despite the fact that I know that they're meeting and I don't know what they're talking about, we do also have a rich exchange of letters between the two of them that gives some evidence of some of their discussions. And in letter after letter, they were exchanging their thoughts and developing plans for distributing the collection, the Stieglitz collection, to public institutions. And I just have to share this. So Rich started every single letter, "Dear Georgia." They were largely typed. And then O'Keeffe, with her wonderful swooping handwriting, saluted Rich with sort of a variety of takes on his entire name. She never just said, "Dear Dan." It was always something like, most commonly, "My dear Daniel Catton Rich," or "My dear Dan Rich," which somehow I find, I think she just loved the sound of it. So their letters reveal a number of things, and their thorniest debate was clearly about what is called the key set. And the key set is a group of over 1,600 photographs mounted by Stieglitz himself, and carefully selected by they're mounted by Stieglitz, and each print was then carefully selected by O'Keeffe to form this amazing group. And it was intended, the key set was really intended to showcase Stieglitz's significance as a photographer throughout his career. Now, interestingly, O'Keeffe originally planned that the key set would be donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which makes sense. But she changed her mind when the Met, very stubbornly, in her opinion, refused to accept them in Stieglitz's mats. They had a certain size box and they wanted to remat all of Stieglitz's photographs to fit in their standard storage boxes. And that was not gonna work. And so O'Keeffe and Rich spent quite a lot of time discussing back and forth the merits of first the Library of Congress as the recipient. And frankly, both of them had concerns about that, about whether that would be suitable. And Rich then actually pushed her quite hard to consider a different New York museum because of Stieglitz's long association with New York. But in the end, O'Keeffe was her own woman, and she selected the National Gallery of Art. It was an idea suggested by the DC collector Duncan Phillips, but it was actually the status of the National Gallery that really appealed to O'Keeffe. She wrote to Rich in December 1948, quote, Stieglitz worked for the recognition of photography as a fine art. The National Gallery means something in relation to that. And so in other words, O'Keeffe sees the National Gallery as the way of establishing Stieglitz's legacy as a fine art photographer by creating and then donating this gift to the nation's art museum. So this is a case where I think their debates helped her refine her thinking. Now, many of their other discussions focused on specific works and sort of other very specific ideas. So for example, in November of 1947, O'Keeffe wrote to Rich, quote, I wonder if I could give you the cow skull with white rose reproduced in your catalog of my show as my first item of my group to go with the Stieglitz collection for the Institute. And then she added, as if there was a question, will you let me know? I'm willing to give you a demyth if you can't accept my painting or don't want it. But needless to say, Rich agreed enthusiastically, and so this work entered our collection 2 years before the primary Stieglitz gift in 1949. Now, throughout much of this period, what's also interesting is that O'Keeffe stored a lot of Stieglitz's collection at the Art Institute. And this is because in 1947, the Museum of Modern Art held exhibitions of Stieglitz's photographs and his collection, as you can see on the screen here. And the Art Institute was to be the second venue. And so everything shipped to to Chicago. But as this is all happening, the Museum of Modern Art refused to publish a catalog of the Stieglitz collection. And so this too disappointed O'Keeffe tremendously. And so as a result, O'Keeffe left the exhibitions in storage at the Art Institute after our venue of the show had closed. And she and Rich continued to confer about the disposition of the Stieglitz collection, with, in fact, the Art Institute then shipping works across the country as decisions were made. And so it's perhaps not surprising that in December of 1948, and so we're now months prior to the main gift, again in 1949, O'Keeffe gave the museum Charles Demuth's And the Home of the Brave. And this was a decision clearly aided by the fact that this painting was in our storage already. And that's where, in fact, O'Keeffe, I think, demonstrated her business acumen and sort of the significance of what this was for her as she's dealing with this gigantic estate, is because her letters reflect that she needed the tax write-off. She essentially writes to Dan Rich and says, you know, I'd like to give you this, but I need the tax form by the end of the year. So there's definitely ways that she is thinking through a lot of different issues at this time. So all this time I've been spending telling the story, or sort of some aspects of the story of how the Stieglitz collection was distributed and what led up to it. But I think it's also important to think about what actually O'Keeffe did give to the Art Institute, because it's truly a tremendous legacy, one that radically transformed what the Art Institute had in its collection already. And there's several ways of categorizing the group of 390 works, but I think it makes the most sense to look first at works by artists of the European avant-garde, which is the smallest group. Then I'll look at photography briefly, and then finally look at O'Keeffe and her closest circle. Now, works by European artists were across the board acquired by Stieglitz after he had shown their art at his Gallery 291. So for example, there are 9 drawings in the collection by Auguste Rodin that Stieglitz exhibited in January of 1908. And I'm showing you just 2 examples. And this is the show that O'Keeffe remembered seeing. O'Keeffe visited this Rodin drawings exhibition while she was studying at the Art Students League. And she later recalled, quote, "The drawings were curved lines and scratches with a few watercolor washes and didn't look anything like I had been taught about drawing. At the time, they were of no interest to me, but many years later, when I was settling Stieglitz's estate, they were the drawings I most enjoyed." So she parcels them out. Likewise, O'Keeffe gave the Art Institute 2 vibrant watercolors by Francis Picabia, which Picabia painted while he was visiting New York in 1913. Stieglitz then exhibited that same year, and they entered his collection. We have Pablo Picasso represented by the groundbreaking Head of a Woman, which is his first large-scale cubist sculpture. And you can see next to it the related drawing for it. And this is a case where Stieglitz exhibited the drawing twice, first in 1911 and then in 1915. Meanwhile, he purchased the bronze in 1912. He then photographed it and published his own photographs of it in camera work. So this was a very special piece for Stieglitz, certainly in that regard. But one of my personal favorites is this fantastic portrait by none other than the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. Now, of course, Rivera is famed for his public art of the 1920s and 30s, but in fact, what many people don't know is that Rivera worked in Paris as a cubist painter in the 19-teens. And he painted this portrait of his lover, Marevna, who was a Russian-born painter and writer. And apparently they had a very tumultuous relationship, and that's, I think, expressed in her pinched little face. And this is a case, I will say, where we actually don't know when or why Stieglitz acquired this painting. This was not shown at 291, but it was exhibited in 1916 at the Modern Gallery by Marius de Zayas. And Zayas, of course, is Stieglitz's friend. He sort of becomes his competitor, but it would make sense, therefore, that maybe Stieglitz acquired it around 1916. Now, I'll turn next to the second grouping of photographs. And not surprisingly, this does constitute the largest part of the Stieglitz collection at the Art Institute, with 244 photographs included in the gift. And of those, 149 were by Stieglitz himself. Now, this is certainly not a group that therefore can be considered the key set, but it is certainly a microcosm of it. It's a grouping of photographs by Stieglitz that really demonstrates the full range of his career and includes just absolutely exceptional prints that O'Keeffe spent weeks selecting. And so some of these include early examples such as the net mender on the left, which is an extremely large, sort of oversized and gorgeously toned print. And then on An Icy Night in New York is a lovely example of his pictorialist work in Manhattan. We also have such things as this rare print of the steerage. I think this is an incredibly familiar image for most people, but in fact, what you often see are photogravures of it, not gelatin silver prints. So it's unusual in that regard. And then we certainly have a beautiful array of equivalents, which are Stieglitz's cloud photographs that also, I think, relate to O'Keeffe's work. And then finally, there's a tremendous assortment of photographs of O'Keeffe herself. And these are, of course, the photographs that marked the beginning of their relationship, but which also then became a significant influence on how O'Keeffe's work was being received in the early 1920s, often to her chagrin. But it is an important part of sort of telling the Stieglitz and O'Keeffe story. So we're very lucky in that regard. Now there's also any number of photographs by Stieglitz's peers, including Frank Eugene, Gertrude Casimir, and Clarence White, which you see here. And I will say, as I was thinking about this lecture, I was fascinated to see how many of these works that are part of the Stieglitz collection are in fact portraits of Stieglitz himself. And I think that very much reflects his centrality in the lives and careers of these artists. But probably my favorite group amongst the photographs are the 15 photographs by Edward Steichen, which is, I think, the largest group of any other photographer besides Stieglitz himself. But they range from the absolutely wonderful and dramatic self-portrait that you see here, in which Steichen envisions himself as a quintessential romantic artist. And he's really sort of manipulated the print and done unique things to it in a way that's fascinating. And then on the right is the pool, which is just a delicate and beautiful landscape. That's a platinum print. Now, interestingly, the final sort of small subset of the Stieglitz part of a collection of photographs also contains a number of works by influential photographers of the 19th century, including Julia Margaret Cameron and the pair Hill and Adamson. And this is significant because these are pioneers of photography who were central to the development of the medium in the 19th century, and in particular were influential in helping shape Stieglitz's own beliefs about photography as a fine art medium. So he sees them as sort of the important precursors. But all told, this large group of Stieglitz collection photographs radically changed the museum's holdings. And that's because prior to 1949, there were no holdings. There was no department of photography. There was no curator of photography. And there was, I think, literally a handful of photographs in the collection. So this very careful selection of both 19th and 20th century works of photographs really formed, as Rich wrote, the tremendous nucleus of future development. So this is what started photography at the Art Institute. Now, the final group of works that comprised the Stieglitz collection consisted, not surprisingly, of art by O'Keeffe's closest circle: Charles Demuth, Arthur Dove, Marsden Hartley, John Marin, and then, of course, O'Keeffe herself. Now, O'Keeffe included 9 works by Demuth in the Stieglitz collection, including, I mentioned, the early gift of And the Home of the Brave, and as well as Second Oil. And both of these works are linked by his interest in depicting factories in his hometown of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And they're really sardonic, almost satiric looks at industrialization of modern life. With And the Home of the Brave, the title, of course, directly evokes the national anthem and suggests, therefore, that the new home of the brave, and that the anthem was adopted in the same year this was painted in 1931, he's really suggesting that the factory is the new home of the American people. While business overlays a factory exterior, the architecture of a factory, with a calendar grid to suggest the regimentation of time forced upon an industrial society. But other Demuth works in the collection are quite different. They're watercolors, and they really underscore his versatility in that medium. And I'm showing you here on the left an early Cubist image of Bermuda. And then in the middle, one of his many absolutely gorgeous floral still lifes. He did any number of floral still lifes and fruit still lifes from this period that are stunning. And then finally on the right is a watercolor called On That Street, which depicts 3 men meeting in an alley. And this is an image that clearly alludes to Demuth's own sexuality from very near the end of his life, and was very much part of the dialogue of this circle. Arthur Dove is represented by 12 works, which I think reflects O'Keeffe's particular admiration for his art. And the earliest work is this richly colored, absolutely stunning pastel, Nature Symbolized 2, which is one of a series of very early abstractions by Dove that demonstrate why I think he is rightfully considered one of the most avant-garde artists working in the United States at this time. I think Dove is woefully undervalued in many ways. And this is a pastel that was shown at Stieglitz's gallery in 1912. And then interestingly, it showed up in Chicago and was shown at a gallery here in Chicago in 1912, where it completely mystified critics who had never heard or seen anything of abstract art. So it feels very, appropriate that it came back to Chicago. But Dove's love of nature is apparent in many other works in this group. It includes Silver Sun, which is on the left, and Telegraph Pole on the right. And in these paintings, we see Dove simplifying elements. He's toying with scale, and he's looking to capture the fundamental forms and forces of nature. So for example, the shimmering concentric circles of silver and blue that suggest the sun radiating outwards, and then this tiny reflection in the bottom in the water. Or on the right in Telegraph Pole, this impression of a rain-slicked pole. And what I think is also important with these works and fascinating is how it demonstrates his experimentation with materiality. Both of these are employing non-traditional materials, whether it be metallic paint in both or the steel plate, sort of heavy steel plate that Telegraph Pole is painted on. And then while nature was always an important inspiration for Dove, he was also experimenting in other realms. And this is a tremendous, if not actually very large painting called Swing Music, or Louis Armstrong. And it's where Dove has painted his sensations while listening to jazz records. So it's in many ways an expression of pure feeling, and yet once again also demonstrates his experimentation, because he was mixing wax in to sort of achieve different textures that I think also reflect how he was thinking about the texture of music. Now, looking at Hartley was represented by 9 works, including this large abstract painting created in Berlin. And like Swing Music, it's about the connection between music and painting, but of course to a completely different aesthetic end. But my favorite works by Hartley in the Stieglitz collection are by far these two, which he painted in New Mexico. The first is The Last of New England, The Beginning of New Mexico, and he painted it in 1918, sort of 1919, during his 18 months in the Southwest. And he really found the Southwest to be alive with potential, and he was seeking rejuvenation. He wrote to Stieglitz, quote, "I like the country very much, for it is big and clean and true, and there is nothing dirty standing between one and the sunlight as there is in the East." And I think we see that optimism reflected in the painting on the right, Cash Entry Mines, which he actually completed after he had left the Southwest. But you can see this sort of rich blue and white sky and these soaring hills that coalesce into, I think, a work of tremendous optimism. Now, the largest group by O'Keeffe's peers consists, in fact, of works by John Marin, and it's 74 watercolors and prints and 1 oil painting. And these arrived in 2 batches in 1949 and 1956. And it's a number that really ensured that enabled O'Keeffe to ensure that the Art Institute would be amongst the foremost repositories of Marin's art. And these are 2 of his vibrant New York watercolors, but we have Maine watercolors equally well represented. And these are both in the original frames designed by the artist. As with Hartley, we have some beautiful Southwestern landscapes that you can see here. He traveled there in 1929 and again in 30, and he painted over 100 watercolors of the striking terrain. And these also have original frames. You can see how each one is painted particular colors to harmonize with the dominant colors of the landscape. And then finally, we have an excellent selection of his prints, from early European views to this one of, which is Notre Dame on the left as an example, to New York scenes on the right, just a few years later. And you can really see his development as a modernist in this short period of time. Now, interestingly, the 1 oil in the Art Institute's collection was not on the original lists from the Stieglitz collection. So this was not, in fact, owned ever by Stieglitz. Because in fact, in January 1949, O'Keeffe wrote to Rich, and she said, quote, "I thought you might like to arrange a trade with Marin, exchange some of the watercolors for an oil." And that's precisely what happened. 5 watercolors were returned to John Marin, and the museum paid a small additional sum of money to acquire movements, boats, and objects, which the artist had painted only 2 years before. And it also bears an artist painted frame around it in these multiple colors. And I think this trade really exemplifies how O'Keeffe is thinking about the legacy of what she wanted museums to have. Now, last but not least, of course, I will not ignore Georgia O'Keeffe, our birthday girl. There are 11 works by O'Keeffe herself that bear the Stieglitz collection credit line. And I should say, we obviously have other works by O'Keeffe in the collection, but I won't get into those tonight. So I've already mentioned we acquired these 2 works in 1943 and 1947, respectively. And I began the lecture talking about her bequest works. But in fact, what's interesting is that the 1949 gift did not include a single other work by O'Keeffe. Every single gift that we have by O'Keeffe came in later years. And she wrote in that year, in 1949, she wrote to Rich and she said, quote, "A combination of modesty and shyness makes me put very few of my own paintings with the collection. We'll speak of this when I see you and add some things if you wish." Well, clearly Daniel Catt and Rich did wish to have some O'Keeffes, because what happened is that in 1949, they placed many of her planned gifts on long-term loan to the Art Institute. And this happened at the Met as well, for example. And O'Keeffe only officially donated them in later years. Now, this might reflect the modesty that she was referring to, but frankly, it was also very good business sense. Throughout her marriage to Stieglitz, O'Keeffe was the one who retained the titles to her paintings. They were never his. They were not officially part of the Stieglitz collection, and she could control them and sort of allocate them as she saw fit, not as part of the estate. So by slowly gifting them over time, she was looking to honor the spirit of the the Stieglitz collection, but frankly, just as we saw at the D-Myth, she always wanted to make sure her tax documents were in order. So she was managing the sort of financial aspects of the collection as well. Now, the earliest work, I showed you this before, is Blue and Green Music, which is just a dynamic abstraction that explores the connection between music and art, as we saw with Hartley and Dove. And this is a case where you can really almost hear, the different elements of the music, sort of what are the wavy lines? Maybe they're a flute. What's the black streak, a blare of horns? It's a really evocative work from this early moment in her career. We also have the brilliant Yellow Hickory Leaves with Daisy, which she painted at Lake George in the summer of 1928. And it's really one of the only paintings of this type in our collection, of this sort of magnified floral or natural forms. We didn't receive these sort of big flower paintings that you tend to think of with O'Keeffe. We do have a single exquisite Canadian landscape that just absolutely glows with color. And then, of course, the Southwest is beautifully represented with works such as The Black Place and Red and Pink Rocks with Teeth. But having said all this, I would also be remiss in ignoring O'Keeffe's largest, and by this I mean physically the largest, gift to the Art Institute of Chicago. And that is, of course, Sky Above Clouds, which measures some 24 feet wide by 8 feet tall. And as many of you probably know, this is the culminating painting in a series of works inspired by her travels around the world in an airplane. Now, this is technically not part of the Stieglitz collection, but I think it really represents an important moment in the relationship between O'Keeffe and the museum. And that's because in 1971, Sky Above Clouds arrived at the museum for a major retrospective of her career. So another sort of groundbreaking retrospective. And the show had opened at the Whitney Museum in New York, and it was scheduled to travel on to San Francisco. But while the painting was on display in Chicago, the organizers of the show realized it was not going to fit into the museum in San Francisco. I think it wouldn't fit in the elevator, if I recall. So they left it in Chicago, and the show traveled on. And so it stayed there for another 12 years. And then finally in 1983, the museum acquired it from O'Keeffe. She actually gave us 50% of it. We paid for the other 50% of it. But it really ensured that it would soar over our galleries for years to come as a testament to her long relationship with the Art Institute. So in conclusion, in a 1949 article, Daniel Catton-Rich described Stieglitz's photographs as a brilliant pictorial record. But I'm hoping through this lecture that I think you can say the same about his entire collection. It is a brilliant pictorial record of the artistic activities and advocacy of one of the most influential people in modern art in the United States. The group certainly represents Stieglitz's lifelong dedication to showcasing and shaping the parameters of aesthetic creativity, whether through his own talents as a photographer or through his determination to promote the work of so many other painters, photographers, and sculptors. O'Keeffe was central to this dream. She was central to his dream for his legacy. But while he formed the collection, it was O'Keeffe who was powerfully responsible for its elevation in museums, where it could be seen and discussed in perpetuity. With her actions, O'Keeffe herself became the arbiter of art history. In essence, she codified the canon of American art and photography that at the time was still very much up for discussion and debate. Now, in the deed of gift granted to the Art Institute in 1949, this entire big deed, O'Keeffe stipulated that the museum could not sell any part of the Stieglitz collection for 25 years, and I don't think we've sold any of it. But this 25-year restriction reflected very much her own thoughts and uncertainties on the collection's lasting power. Times were changing, and she really couldn't anticipate whether her art or the art made by her husband or collected by his husband would continue to be appreciated and be impactful. In great hesitation, she wrote to Rich one last time, quote, I often wonder what sort of a place a collection like this will have after 25 years. I keep wondering, will it lose or gain? And now, with the hindsight of over 70 years, I think the answer is apparent to all of us. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Let me see if I can stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a wonderful overview of the collection there. It's so awesome that it's there in Chicago. We have a couple questions, and if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat and I will try to get to them. One was about Daniel Cotton Rich. Did he advocate at all for the Stieglitz key set to be at the Art Institute, or did he believe so strongly that it should be in New York that he didn't advocate for it to come to Chicago?
I have thought about this exact question a lot because I wondered that. I'm like, why would Rich? You know, it's like nowadays all museum directors would be angling for it. You know, so I did wonder, like, why would Rich not do it? But he really didn't. I mean, maybe he did in person and there's no record of it, but in no point in the letters is there any indication that he thought it should come to the Art Institute. And I think it is because we had no collection. I mean, pretty much at this point in 1949, anything is better than the nothing that we had, you know, and I don't know if he didn't think that the Art Institute could handle it. I mean, it's a massive collection, you know, but it's very clear from the letters, he is pushing for New York. So I think he's set on the New York, a New York home for it. And so I think O'Keeffe really takes him by surprise when she then says, nope, we're going with the National Gallery. And that's sort of the end of it. You know, that was the end of the discussion. But I did wonder, I was like, oh, you know.
Interesting. Well, and I guess this kind of builds on that question too. Did O'Keeffe, when she was giving items to the Art Institute, did she provide any funds for their care?
No. I mean, we have always had a conservation department. I mean, and O'Keeffe worked with specific conservators sort of in New York, Thelrath Hines and others around the country. But we had a conservation department from the early years of the 20th century. So I think that, you know, she knew that they would be well cared for here. So certainly, but no, I think it was just expected that we would take care of them. Right. Which we have. So.
Right. And then going back to earlier in your talk, why did Moma refuse to create a catalog of the Stieglitz show? Have you found any research about that?
I have, yes. I mean, you know, it is interesting because she's pretty open with Rich in her letters about her irritations and her frustrations. And so from what I can piece together, and again, this is seen through the O'Keeffe lens. So how much of it is grumbling, you know, how much of it is real, I'm not totally sure yet. But basically, Moma was building a new building at this point, and she pretty much grumbled to Rich that they don't want to publish a catalog because they want the money for the catalog to go to the building. So she's pretty upset that they won't do this because they've sort of sucked the money off into a different purpose. So she actually starts considering, you know, can I pay for it myself? Maybe I should sell some things. So she's talking with Rich, like maybe I sell a few works and I pay for the catalog myself. But it doesn't happen through Moma. And, you know, they don't get, what I haven't figured out, and it's hard to figure out from the language, is I feel like they were supposed to get a slice of the Stieglitz collection and that doesn't happen. So, and I don't know if it's because of this situation. So,
yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess a question too related to that a bit, is Rich's essay in his catalog available online or in print anywhere to read?
It is. It's probably not in print, I mean, unless you find it in a used bookstore, but actually if you go to our website and go to our exhibition page, somewhere on there's a little clickable link to an archive, and you can just look under 1943 or search on O'Keeffe, and it will come up with you know, the exhibition, and you can actually download the whole catalog. So
oh, that's amazing. That's awesome that you have that available. That's so neat.
I know it's been very helpful during a pandemic to be able to download these things from our own website. So,
I bet. Yeah. Well, one final question. Do you rotate the items in the collection, or are they always on display? How do you handle that?
So the works on paper do rotate in and out. We'll do exhibitions of American modernism, things like that. The photographs likewise get used for a whole host of different exhibitions. And then the paintings, we are very fortunate. So the family who helped us purchase Sky Above Clouds, the Rosenbaum family, also funded, sort of endowed a gallery for the Stieglitz collection. So we have, at any one time, at least, there's sort of various stipulations. We have to have at least 10 O'Keeffes on at all time. We have to have, other works from the Stieglitz collection. So we generally have, anywhere from 20 to 30 Stieglitz collection works on view of the paintings, and then sort of in different galleries as well. So, so they're sort of all over. But yeah, the works on paper are harder to show, so they do come out less frequently. So.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this talk. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
And I know I saw a question in chat too about, will there be a recording? Yes, there will be. It will be on our website next week, so you can look for that. So thank you, Sarah, and happy birthday to Georgia O'Keeffe.
I know. Thank you for letting me celebrate her birthday with you all. So
yes, have a good evening, everyone.
right.
Thank you.
Good night.